Okay. Okay, we're back in gear here, right? And we'll wait until Janet's finished sharing with Michael. We having the COVID conversations. That was one of the more fascinating moments on our trip was our guide saying, "Well, the last trip I had, someone felt a little sick, and so we tested for COVID, and he had it, and all the rest of us tested, and everyone had it except two of us." And we looked and said, "So what did you do?" And he said, "Well, the protocol is that we're supposed to follow the trip ball." But he didn't answer the question. Because if he calls the trip ball, his tips are gone.
Everybody has it,
but two. Well, and there was a moment when there was a big sandstorm that we were walking in, and I got a sort of a sinus mess and felt like crap for a couple of days. I know some of the people on the tour wanted us to test, but the tour guide never said a word. We just said, "Yeah, he's got it figured out." Yeah, exactly. And then 4 days before we're supposed to come home, we got an email from somebody, might have been Michael, saying, "Guess what? The U.S. has lifted its requirements. We have to have it." Fantastic. So, all right, we're gonna start here after 2 months off here. We're August. Yes. John, you want to? Where's John? John's. Well, Iko can share. That's August 3rd. Yeah, how was share with us a little bit of the session that we all missed with the paleo. Yeah.
It was great.
We'll share it with. Was anyone else here? Bob didn't. Harold was there.
I'm not objective. Why don't you, as somebody from the outside, talk about what David talked about?
It was
I was there, but I had a glass of wine with dinner.
No. But you had the connection to the love train.
Oh, yeah. So Ramsay, he's showing these slides. He showed a slide of a woman and two men. He says, "This da-di-da-di," and the third guy is Eric Clare. And I said, "Holy shit!" So this was like I guess when Claire was in Burma, and he rendezvoused with these guys, and they were doing this paleo archaeology thing. He just happened to be there. Boy, talk about a small world.
Man, they lead a greasy sort of life. Who would have thought?
Well, you're sitting around in Burma with nothing else to do.
Well, they had grown up together.
Oh, so this was the secondary connection.
David, the speaker, was big because he spent, I think, 5 years in Singapore, working for the Singapore museum.
The Raffles Museum.
Exploring the history of Singapore and the geology and the archaeology. I'd like to have, I'm trying to convince them to come and sample what we're doing.
Work on it. Yeah, work on it. Work on it. All right, so we'll go ahead and do this. We got daylight. We can stay here till 10 o'clock and still be light. Huh? If you're hanging in there, we got 2 more sessions after this. Chapters 18 and 21 get us, I think, up through the Cold War, and then in September we'll finish it off. But if you, I'd read this stuff a long time ago and sort of half forgot it. But when I reviewed it, I said, "Oh yeah, this is typical Frankopan. He's got a different take on things, like what caused World War I." So John and I, somewhere along the way, will have another spat over what caused World War I, because we've had multiple spats over what caused World War I. But Frankopan's on my side. So.
Yeah, and it's really hard to get your head around the major conflict at the time was between Britain and Russia.
Yeah, hell yeah. Hell yeah. Europe is so irrelevant, as anyone that's got euros now knows. All right, so let's see. I forgot. How do we do this? Let me see. Do we do it this way? No, not this way. Yeah. So chapter 14, 15, 16, 17, the road to empire. Of course, the road to empire is going to be the British Empire naturally, because he's a Brit. I should have, I'm supposed to have stuff that follow along. We were panicked coming over. No, I put it somewhere else.
What are you looking for?
And I'm looking for what I put somewhere. My book and,
There's a bag over on the floor.
yeah, well, no.
Specifically.
Yes, good. Question notes in here. I'm supposed to follow along my own questions. So he makes the point that as the Ottoman Empire is going to, how do these factors fit into the British Empire being what it is, from the dominant force in the world for about 100 years. The decline of the Ottoman Empire. You've been over this many times. You've seen these maps before. It's a stunning piece of success for a while. That is far on the outskirts of Vienna by 1683. And then what happens to the Ottoman Empire? So that slowly over time declines. Well, one, there's forever battles with the Safavid dynasty in Persia. And those are serious, and it sucks up a lot of energy on both sides. The Safavids will decline first, but even so, the Ottoman Empire has been weakened. And the other factor that's always mentioned is this is an empire that had to expand. It was based on expansion because the people that were going to be loyal to the Sultan, as far as the army goes, expected to get the spoils of expansion. And when the spoils of expansion no longer existed, things were going to be, the battle would be internally, not externally. And so but we're not talking about the Ottoman Empire. And the decline is unbelievable the last 100 years, from a still fairly large empire in 1683 to almost nothing by the time World War I starts. And this is old stuff. This opens the door for anybody, Britain included. Primogeniture. I think most of you know the term, but if you know it, and we take it for granted because we're of an Anglo-Saxon background. But what's the idea of primogeniture as far as inheritance goes? The eldest son gets it all, and the daughter doesn't get anything. The eldest son gets it all. That sounds so crappy, and in many ways it is. But the argument goes, it has advantages. The advantages are, what are the advantages as far as creating empire, creating wealth goes? You're not subdividing, which is it continues to be a problem in Latin America because they're working under Spanish law. That is, everyone gets a fair share. Whether that actually works out or not is another issue, but that's supposedly what happens. And when you've got a farm of 3 acres and 3 sons, then there's only 1 acre per son, and then there's almost nothing. So if you have primogeniture, then the whole pot goes to one person who has the possibility, not the guarantee, but the possibility of using that wealth to expand and grow and so forth. And so it was in merry old England right up to late. The mercantile, the navigation acts, flat out mercantilism. What's the concept of mercantilism? which John Smith wrote his whole book about. He hated mercantilism. I mean, Adam Smith. Adam Smith. I mean, that was what the book was about, essentially. Yeah.
I know you want to finish.
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah. Yeah. Perfect. Perfect. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And so it creates there's all sorts of books written about that. The second, and of course there's that to some degree explains the Spanish or the Latin American War of Independence, because primogeniture still existed in Spain at that time. And the eldest, no, I've got it wrong. I'm saying that wrong. The eldest son, who was still in Spain, would be the one that had the greatest power over the colonies that the Spanish family had over in Latin America. The second and third sons were stuck in Latin America. The oldest son wanted to stay home. I don't want to go to Latin America. It's hot over there. There's malaria over there. I just want the wealth as the eldest son. And the youngest son said, well, this given the opportunity, we've been looking for an excuse forever to overthrow our eldest sons. And Napoleon gives the Latin American colonies that excuse when he takes over Spain.
So, just an interesting sideline on that. In the colonies, there were a lot of second sons that came to the colonies. And I imagine there were a lot of second sons that went to India, right? But in South Carolina, in specific, they grabbed onto that notion and they embedded it in their symbols. So there's something about the palmetto tree, which is the state tree, that has to do with being a second son. I can't speak it.
Well, so yeah, thank you, Paul. Yeah, and this is a bigger deal than we should just pass by as if it's almost nothing. It does create jealousy, but also the possibility that the second son will become a priest, and that will at some stage create some state church rivalry in some of these countries as well. In any case, as a possibility. That mercantilism. What is mercantilism? What is that? What is that concept? Well, more than stuff. That a state runs its entire foreign policy on the basis of making sure that the nation benefits from trade. It's a war. It's not a free trade arrangement. There's a concept that there's a war out there for trade, and we as a nation have to win. And of course, everyone does that when they're developing. It's only later that some nations start promoting free trade. And when do you start promoting free trade? When you've won, when you've got most of the colonies, when you've got most of the wealth, when you can create most of the. So Britain will not promote free trade until Adam Smith writes the book. But at the start, here's England behind France, behind Spain, behind a number of other powers in Europe, and they're going to promote, create whatever laws they can, whatever they can get away with to make sure that England gets the majority of the trade benefits. What are the navigation acts? Cromwell was the first to create a navigation act. What are navigation, which our colonists hated? It was one of the great. We should read the Declaration of Independence, which comes around every July 4th. There's a whole lot of stuff in there about mercury, about the Navigation Acts. What do the Navigation Acts say? Everything's got to leave the colonies on English boats, and it can't, and all of it's got to go to London first. And once it's in London first, then the English government has the possibility of saying, that's it, we're going to keep it all. We're going to keep all the iron, all the lumber, all of whatever is coming from the New World. Or if you merchants want to sell it, we're going to tax it first before you sell it to the French. And there's navigation acts, blah, blah, blah. You can see the last one is just before the War of Independence. It's one of the great, and T is part of it, and he talks about it.
So you mentioned in the book that the taxation in the colonies was less than English.
Way less.
Yeah. So I'd always got the impression. And trade was more.
No.
So it was less. And
Well, especially the French and American War, which is known as the 7 Years' War. It was a much bigger war. So the British are saying, look, we just defended you, colonists, from the French, and we're broke. Our citizens are paying 3, 4, 5 times more taxes than you are. You owe us. It's fair that you pay some of the freight for, and that an honest person was, and the retort was, and the retort to that was, you do. And the retort to that was, yeah, but we didn't choose them. You chose them for us. And so back and forth it went. And there's arguments on both of that. We'll get to the Tea Act here in a minute, like, or 2 hours or whatever. The tea thing was part of this stuff. So Samuel Pepys, remember, was that ever introduced in any class you ever had, Samuel Pepys' diaries? I always thought it was going to be sexual stuff and this and that. And he said, no, it's all about navigation. It's all about, this is how the Dutch created their ships. And Samuel Pepys is going to be create this diary about that the British and the Dutch have got better ships than we do, and this is how they did it, and we could do better. In any case, there's a commitment from the British government that we're going to have a better navy. And they not only have a better navy in terms of size, but in professional ranks. And they're just copying the Dutch. Everyone that sees the future is copying the Dutch in the 16th and 17th century. And the British do too. Of course, they got a Dutch king, William and Mary. What else? Well, there's all these wars, the Anglo-Dutch wars, one after another, after another, after another. And what's the end result of the Dutch and Anglo wars? Well, the British end up with better ships, larger ships, and they basically steal the Dutch empire. They steal South Africa. They steal, well, we call it, what was it once called? Before it was, New Amsterdam. Now it's called New York. What they never get, because they don't need to, they make an arrangement in the Spice Islands, Indonesia, but they will get quite a bit, and a lot of the Dutch colonies in India as well. This and that, so forth. So all of this happening. There's too much detail here. I don't want to go. The most famous of the Anglo wars, in some sense, was the second of these, where it was back and forth. This was a real tug of war, where the English prevailed and the Dutch prevailed and the English prevailed. But finally, it was over, and the English pretty much had the run of the show, especially after, we've talked about this before, the War of Spanish Succession, which is over in 1714. The War of Spanish Succession is, in theory, about who's going to be, which pretender to the throne in Spain is going to be the next king after the perpetually sick king finally dies. And Louis XIV says, well, I want it to be one of the pretenders. Who's probably got the most legitimate claim is for my family, is a Bourbon. And that ends up turning out to be true. But the English eventually prevail in that English war. And the English get, what do the English get besides many other things, besides property, as a result of winning, of being the prime winner of the War of Spanish Succession? They get the asiento. What was the asiento? The right to transport black slaves to Latin America, which was what Spanish had. But they say, we want the asiento. This is not all black slaves. Black slaves were going to North America as well. And a great deal of money will be made on that slave trade. And then there's the East India Company, which becomes the heart, the utter heart, the core of the British Empire, which is going to be founded completely copying the Dutch East India Company, which was the model early on. It's a joint stock company. Did you remember this from the Dutch? Who was allowed to buy stock? Who was encouraged to buy stock? Pretty much everybody. And so it became, to some degree, everyone could afford, but there was a fair amount of people that could afford to buy stock. So it became kind of a national company, almost a nationalized company. Well, it was kind of, because the Dutch government supported the ships that were going to protect the trade, and the English are going to do exactly the same thing. And until until the Russians are going to challenge them. At least that's Frankopan's story. And the company is just enormous. You look at the last paragraph here. At the peak, they've got 250,000 soldiers, which is way, way more than the British have, the British government itself has. And they're at some level a government of their own, but it's not as if they're operating without the cooperation of the British government. They're being subsidized by the British government, both in terms of banking and loans and this and that and so forth. And eventually that becomes quite obvious. I debated taking this thing out. Why Frankopan throws this in here, I'm not quite sure. But it is, from American point of view, it is sort of interesting. He makes this point that, well, so what was Puritanism all about? What was it all about? In England, it was the notion that the Church of England is corrupt. It's really no different than the Catholic Church, which in theory it's different from, but really is the same. And we want the Church of England to be purified. And some of the people that weren't willing to wait any longer came to New England. And we know them as the Puritans. But they left behind the third paragraph here. A lot of their relatives or their friends that were also Puritans stayed behind, and most of those people, or many of those people that stayed behind, were essentially the crowd that invented the Industrial Revolution, because they were. And why would they have done that? Why would they have been motivated to invent the Industrial Revolution or to make money a different way than going in the government? Because they weren't allowed to go in the government. As a Puritan, you weren't trustworthy. And so you weren't allowed to go to the government. So, well, okay, if we can't go to the government, we can't be part of the British East India Company, we can't get a plum job because we have connections all over the place. We'll do science. And if you go down the list of people who invented the Bessemer furnace, the first coal power plants in Ironbridge, England, and methods for burning impurities out of coal and building the first iron bridges, they're all Puritans, for whatever that's worth. Not worth a whole lot. This list, going through them one by one, this list, it's an interesting list, and Frankopan has got some sarcasm about the British, about a lot of things, but the British wonderfulness is willing to say, well, history is pretty clear here. There were things that were going on in Britain that were pretty useful in terms of success in inventing the Industrial Revolution. For example, the levels of social and economic inequality in Britain and the consumption of calories. What was the information relative to other European countries? What was the fact of life back then in terms of inequality? Less, a little bit more equal.
Britain had lower levels of economic inequality than other European countries. Bottom tiers of the population had noticeably higher levels of caloric consumption.
It's just a healthier country, and more and less unequal, and that makes sense at some levels, especially compared to France, where you had the first estate, the second estate, 3% of the population that owned most of the wealth, and then 97%, including merchants and peasants, owned much less, and they weren't allowed to be in parliament yet. Yeah. British work efficiency, his argument there is one of these virtuous cycles. If you get more wealth, if there's the possibility of getting wealth, then the motivation for working harder to get wealth grows. And if the motivation for getting wealth grows, then you get more wealth, and it spins in a virtuous cycle. And he says that seemed to work in Britain for some period of time.
Yeah, just to go back to that for a second to the better nutrition. Do you remember that move Peter Jackson did for a documentary where he mashed together all the newsreels of World War and made a movie called I Think They Shall Never Die. The idea being, let's not forget the experience of the British soldier in World War I. And one of the big points they made was how malnourished these recruits were. And it really surprised the Army these guys were malnourished, and you can see in the population newsreel the terrible dentition
Well,
that they have. Missing teeth. I mean, probably eating sugar, and so
Smarties, lots of
the first
Smarties.
thing they did in basic training was feed these guys. So that was so surprising.
You mean this claim that they were better nutrition in the 60s and 17th century? It's a different time period, of course.
200 years later.
200 years later.
Yeah, but what happened before World War I that would have brought them down to maybe even lower than
Good. I don't know the answer. I don't know. You trust, as Bob Oxenberg has made the point before multiple times correctly. I think that this Frankopan could afford to have a great set of researchers that probably did their homework here. So, most of what he claims is probably at least partially true, if not quite substantially true. Who's the guy? The Data Universe James Burke, is that right? Yeah, he makes a big deal about the Dutch having great nutrition and the British copying that as well. The ploughman's, so-called ploughman's lunch that the peasants had. You had beer in a bottle. Drinking beer, that it was safer than drinking water because it was brewed, yada yada, and eggs and this and that and so forth. Yeah, well, the American, there's lots of documentation that the first couple hundred years of the American colonial history, people were sort of high most of the time drinking cider and so forth, because it was safer than drinking the crappy water. Yeah. Even more so, in terms of. Well, I don't know about the fertility stuff. Good point. Good point. Yeah. Good point. Yeah. I mean, there's the satanic mills were exactly that. But now we're talking about the 17th century and the 18th century. British innovation, well, it's the same idea of kind of the virtuous cycle, especially when you have a set of people like we were talking about, the Puritans, who are not allowed in the government. So you make your money somewhere else. You don't study Latin and you don't study the classics. Instead, you do science. And to repeat again, this James Burke, it's a great. I'm gonna send it out. If you've never seen it, but it's credit where credit is due. It's just a fantastic little owl. It's really well done.
I think you showed it.
I think we showed it at one stage. It's for him to cram all that information in 50 minutes is rather stunning. But he makes the point again that these Puritans were innovators, and once you become an innovator, then you train your sons to be innovators, and they were primarily because they studied math and science. British fertility levels. What was the case according to Frankopan's case regarding British fertility levels and size of families? It was smaller than the average family. And some of that, who knows what that was about? But what's the advantage of that? What's the advantage as far as the development go of having smaller families, which is now being discovered by every third world mother and child. You can devote more of your wealth, limited wealth, to a few kids and better education. You will spend more time with them. They'll be probably more emotionally stable because there's only going to be 2 or 3 of them, probably 7. So you were invested in them. This and that. But number one is the last one. They're an island, and it's the trump card. It's a piece of bloody luck. And if you're an island, you have the choice of whether you want to get involved in the endless series of wars going on in the continent, whereas France doesn't, or Spain doesn't. Well, actually, they do. But if you're the biggest country and the most powerful country in Spain in the 15th and 16th century, France in the 17th and part of the 18th century, then you try to maintain that primacy by being involved in every war. You want it to come out the way you want it to come out. Whereas the English, they get in and they get out as they wish, and that's really quite quite an advantage. He says, I think he quotes the idea that somewhere in the late 18th century, the French army was at least 3 times bigger than the British army. You got to maintain it. You got to pay for that.
Like 15% of their economy.
And if you're going to have it, you're probably going to use it. And if you're going to use it, you get involved. Spain had already gone through hell, wasting all their ill-gotten wealth from South America, well, North America too, on endless wars, mostly religious wars. Britain had that choice, so they got this advantage. Even so, anybody that looks at this map 300 years from now will say, "What? This little this little island, kind of cold and rainy, controlled all that territory. Work this out for me." We work it out as if it's just common sense that, of course, this is the way it was going to go, because they had democracy. They didn't. They had about a bunch of other stuff that they really didn't have. They had some advantages and parlayed them rather well into an impressive this and that. India, the heart and soul. Especially when North America's lost anyone, then India will become the heart and soul of the empire. And besides, it was so bloody well. There was so much wealth there, and people to sell to, and people to put to work, and this and that, and so forth. So every European colony, a country that had the ability to get there, the Portuguese first, the Spanish soon after, the French, the Dutch, the British too, are going to try and pick off as much as British of India as they can. And the British are the king of the Rus for a while. And they had this enormous advantage about the time that Britain is getting its navy together, its industrial revolution is getting started. It's at that moment that the Mughal Empire is going to hell in a handbag. So it's just the timing is on their advantage. And by 1707, it is falling apart. I mean, Akbar the Great, who is 1620 to 1650, something like that, has got the Mughal Empire in fantastic shape. But the people that follow him are less and less able to do so. They're more cruel, they're stupid. And so they had the advantage not only of having the best navy, the best this and that, but they also have a less able competitor in India to have to defeat. They don't have the advantage of Germans. They have the disadvantage of Germans, as a matter. The advantage of Germans, of course, is enormously important for North America and South America. They have the disadvantage of Germans. And what comes out of the disadvantage? What are some of the things that come out of all this damn malaria that you get, smallpox that you get? Quinine is developed, and later you get martini. What are the drinks that come with quinine? I don't know. Gin and tonic, yeah, gin and tonic, yeah. I'm drinking it because it's keeping me from getting malaria. Oh, sure you are. Sure you are. So the empire is going to be born, and he's going to make the point. It's the axe he's grinding endlessly, whether you get tired of it or not. I sort of like it. That the Silk Road is the trade of the Silk Road is eventually going to simply collapse. It doesn't collapse until fairly late, but it does, and especially after 1857. So he spends some time talking about the British East India Company with sarcasm, or bitterness, or honesty, or whatever you want to talk about. They were just copying the Dutch East India Company, a joint share company subsidized by the government, this and that, and so forth. But there was this interconnection between the British government and the Dutch East India Company that eventually became obvious. I mean, there's somebody's handwritten. This is, I guess, a black and white drawing that's been colorized of some of the army marching, the British East India Company Army, and most of those soldiers in the British East India Company Army would have been Indians. They weren't British. They were led by British, but they were Indians. and they were getting paid better and so forth. Why wouldn't they be loyal up to a point? And that up to a point was the problem. This guy, I mean, they've all got nasty stories. This is one of the nastiest. The Harvard crowd, the Princeton crowd, founded on opium money. Harvard too. Yale. Who was this? It's a good story if you've never read it before. Where was he born? Right, Massachusetts. He's born in the United States, but he makes his money in England. How does he make his money? He becomes the he goes back to the ancestral home, England. He gets involved in the British East India Company. He is made the governor of Madras, no longer called Madras. Chennai, now it's called Chennai. No longer called Bombay, no longer called Calcutta, but Kolkata or something like that. In any case, he's the and as the story goes, he only survives 5 years as the governor of Madras because it becomes relatively obvious that he is skimming money left and right, and so he's fired. No problem by now. He's accumulated an enormous wealth. He takes it back to England, lives a good life, and doesn't forget his roots in New England, and he devotes the money to founding the Yale and so forth. I don't know. I actually forgot this and went to look it up today and got sidetracked on this. Apparently, his sarcastic wife. There's his tomb, and she has this inscription, which is full of sarcasm. She was happy for him to die, and more than that. And in any case, this was not atypical of some of the governors of the British East India Company. The Diwani, right? Yeah, go ahead.
So with Yale, there's some yarn that there was some provision he made that there was a great collection of books. Maybe it was the second son of the Berkeleys, or as they say, Berkeley. So Berkeley Castle, there was the Bishop Berkeley, and he left all these books, and he figured that they'd go to Yale. He specified the school that's furthest west.
Harvard's too far east.
History unfolds. Long story short, Berkeley wound up claiming Bishop Berkeley's books. We heard this at Berkeley Castle. This is also where the village at the base was where Jenner invented or discovered smallpox. Yeah. So big castle, but it was almost too good to be true. Anybody heard anything like that? The reason Berkeley is called Berkeley because Bishop Berkeley, the second son.
Could well be. Why not? I mean, why are we called Lafayette? Which is actually an interesting question. Lafayette. Why is this called Lafayette?
We got the statue.
We got the statue. Yeah. What's the story, Jen? You know this better than I do. Whoever, when it was time to name the city, the first suggestion was something like Centerville, and people said, "Oh God, Centerville! Everybody's got a Centerville. That's so." But someone was from Illinois and said, "Well, I'm from this town in Illinois called Lafayette, and it's a nice name. Why don't we try Lafayette?" It's some tale like that, but that's Pittsburgh. The most embarrassing thing for me forever, you've heard the story before, but I'll tell it again, is Louisville. Here I'm a history teacher, right? And I'm in Louisville grading AP US history exams. And not terribly full of myself, but at least after this and so forth. And in the evening, after grading the exams, there was a possibility of taking a tour of Louisville. And we got, the group I was on got this fantastic guy. He knew everything, and he talked about our architecture, and he told us a lot of stuff. But at the very end, he took us up to the center of town, and he said, "Well, there's there's a picture of King Louis. And I went, oh my God, I've never figured this out. I never got this. What an ass. It was French territory, King Louis, of course. And I had not gotten it as well as that famous Kentucky liquor called bourbon, or the French would pronounce it Bourbon, the French family of Bourbon. You know, whatever. In any case, what are we? You always do this. You get us off track. Yeah. Well, welcome back.
Well, I had a similar experience that our Christmas translator. The Pittsburgh was going during just years that required expansion of medical system. They all said, well, wait a minute, how's come there's no H? And I,
It's not the real Pittsburgh. We got a proud mom with a daughter on the board, city council in Pittsburgh here. So. Well, the intention was to make Pittsburgh, California, a steel producing, and they said, well, what are you going to do for fuel? And the answer is chop down all these oak trees. There's a whole, and they did. So, I know they got coal. Whatever, it didn't work. Okay, so the Diwani rights. I mean, this is just one of the many examples that I don't even think this was in the book of the British East India Company gaining these benefits by bribing the corrupt governor, or putting the corrupt governor of their choice in power, and then saying, okay, now that we've put you in charge, you give us the rights we want. We get to collect the taxes. We get to decide civil cases. And it isn't long before the British are essentially running India. And over time, there's corruption galore. One of the most famous moments of corruption, I don't know. This is a good story because it ends up with the British Tea Act. If you read this, there's a famine in 1770, kills maybe 10 million people. Based it's crop failures, this and that. Well, crop failures are going to kill people anyway, probably. But it was much, much worse because the British East India Company and their agents were able to corner the market on rice. And having cornered the market on rice, of course, they could raise the prices to the point the peasants couldn't buy. And many would start. The exact same thing would happen with and our potato famine and World War II in India as well. So this will go where the British are trying to hold on to India against the Japanese. They've got supply lines are being cut. The Japanese have already taken Burma, Myanmar, which is a great source of rice. And the British say, we got to corner the market on rice, which they do. But having cornered the market on rice, it's going to be used to feed their soldiers, many of whom are Indian. The Indian peasants can't pay, and there's 20 million die of starvation because they cannot afford rice during World War II. Yeah, 1930s and the 2020s. I mean, there's going to be starvation in East Africa and Egypt this summer because something, the economist said, something like 1/7 of all the calories consumed by humanity comes from the steppes of Central Asia. And that it's sitting there. The harvest starts this week, and whether that harvest of grain, wheat, and sunflower seeds and so forth can leave Odessa and go anywhere. That the Russians stole. I guess there's a big ship sitting in Constantinople right now. So.
I guess I've never really understood India and China, these great civilizations that British civilization by thousands of years, been through political ups
and downs and nagging that goes on, politics and all that. They invented gunpowder in China.
So was it just the Industrial Revolution giving Britain better weapons that, I mean, let's go into a country that you may have 1,000 times the population, but it's an ancient culture that supposedly has experienced all this stuff.
No, it's a fair question. Some of it is simply guns, germs, steel, but it's not germs. Germs don't work. The germs actually work against the British here, so it's just guns and steel to some degree, but it's also wealth. Once the empire, because all of these civilizations fall apart. There's interesting questions facing us. Is it our turn? And maybe it is. It's 300 years is about as long as things last. And this was exactly the case as the British are showing up in India in 1707. To repeat, Akbar the Great had created a united northern India. It wasn't southern India. They didn't. The Muslims said, that's one bridge too far. We're not going to invade southern India. That's stupid. Under Akbar, but after his ancestors said we're going to invade southern India, and they get pushback from the Hindus big time. And they're probably already overextended anyway, spending too much money on courtly crap. And so it's falling apart. And once it falls apart, it's just it's divide and conquer. It's simply let's find all the most corrupt people we can find. We'll give them horses and wealth and whatever they want, and they will and they know how to. They still have status in their community. At least they do for our short period of time. And so the people in their community will listen to them. We got them in our hip pocket. It doesn't work in Afghanistan, but it does. It sure as hell works in India. In China, it's ugly. It's open. Because there were social problems already, as we had too. So we got what's our addiction to phenethol? I mean, we got it. And southern China in particular, because you got to go back to the history of these two countries. China had this under the last great dynasty, unless you want to call it communist, yet another dynasty. The Manchurians, they had the enormous luck, having taken over in 1644, of having three spectacularly successful, wise leaders, all three of which lived at least 50 years. And Britain and China was pretty well run, with these guys sort of keeping their bureaucrats in control or modeling good behavior, or at least not dying. So you have a tension over who's going to be the next emperor. And that lucked right out in 1798 or 1799, or just about right then. As well as the fact that after 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 good generations of bureaucrats behaving well, they stopped behaving poorly and suck up the money. And so by the 1820s, there was problems in society in China. There was more poverty. The wealth gap was growing. The usual corruption was happening, where peasants were being taxed, but the money wasn't going back into the community to do what it was supposed to do for paying taxes. Repair the dikes, keep the examination system fair, blah blah blah. So there was problems, and that's of course almost exactly at the time when that's too early. It'll come 50 years later when the Chinese say we got to get the hell out of here. We're going to the United States. We're going to work with the railroads. And once it starts, once the drug problem starts, it simply snowballs. The drug problem will create more corruption and more social dysfunction, which feeds into kids that aren't raised well and blah blah blah. But even then, we've done. But even then, the Chinese said, "You got to see what you're doing. it's obvious that you're causing this social mess. Queen Victoria, call them off. And Queen Victoria wouldn't answer, and the British, all this crowd, this very crowd that's running the show in India, to say we're making money hand over fist. There are he writes about this. He says there are hearings held about the opium trade in Britain in the British Parliament. The British Parliament says we're not touching it with a 10-foot pole. It's making good money for us. And this is China. Are you kidding me? We've got India. China's going to even be better. And all this does, of course, is breeds this anger that down the road you're going to pay for, as we are now. You want us to not buy Soviet oil? We'll buy all the Soviet oil we want, and we don't give a damn about your white Ukrainians. I mean, yeah, we'll probably get paid for it, but you earned it. You paid for it.
Yeah, so one more thing about China, going back to the Ming Dynasty, they were very, very successful. They were explorers. Admiral Singh had he 7 great expeditions, and all of a sudden, no more. You're back. There's jealousy about the eunuchs in court. He was the eunuch. There's all this politics, and they just closed down. They stopped being outward looking. It would have been like Spain after Columbus said, well, this is interesting. Okay, no more exploration. There was a psychological thing, a sense of self-satisfaction, which McCarthy.
Well, and there was that smug notion of exceptionalism, that we're it. Everything that's ever been invented, we did. We don't need any of your crap. I mean, there was a moment when one of the European companies created built a railroad in India, and the British emperor said, "We'll pay you for it." Paid it for it, dismantled it, and dumped it in the ocean. So it's scaring the horses. This is not all this noise and all this pollution is not the kind of society we want to have. So they didn't get it, and maybe they were right on some of that scaring the horses stuff and creating. But power is power. Ask Putin. He's going to win. Did anyone doubt he's going to win? You do? I think he's going to win. I don't think he's going to take all the Ukraine, but I think he's going to get and the West is going to force a deal on the Ukraine, and that'll be the end of that. And he's not going to get all of Ukraine, but he's going to get to Donbass, and he's going to get to.
Do you think he's going to keep Kherson?
I don't know.
I don't think he is.
What if it's stopping them?
That's exactly the argument that Brett Stevens made at the New York Times today. But the answer is, yeah, you're right, but we can't get the public behind us. They're more interested in $6 a gallon gasoline and so forth. So we're a democracy. We're not. So we got to play. We got to get elected next time. So we're just going to sort of let it go. We'll see. And anyway, power. British credit crisis of 1770. This is a big deal because it will lead to the Tea Act, and to some degree. So what's going on that creates this British credit crisis? Some describe it as the first great banking crisis of the modern era. Maybe Adam Smith wrote about it a lot. Talked about colonies constantly demanding more subsidies from Britain, and the British taxpayers have to subsidize them, and so forth and so forth. But at this moment, there's going to be a lot of expansion of credit, just as happens periodically in this system we've got, which is it happened in 2008. It's probably happened recently, and so we got an inflation problem now. So there's speculation on it in East India Company's stock, and it's not sensible speculation. Then comes the famine, and the famine is going to really reduce the British East India Company's profits, and so there was they've got losses galore, and they're probably going to go bankrupt. So when they are probably going to go bankrupt, to whom do they go? To the British Parliament. Who bails them out? Says, we'll give you a loan. And they bail them out, and they bail them out to the point that in 72, the stock is rising. It's rising not because things have gotten better in India, just because they've been bailed out by the British company, by the British Parliament with stock. And then comes this guy, Alexander Fordyce, tries to do what the Big Short guys did. He says, "This is not real profits. This is bullshit. I'm going to short. I'm going to short this stock and try and make money." And his timing is terrible because the stock price is going up. But he has a lot of investors who have actually bought into his scheme, and they all lose their money. And the British, you get this massive crisis in 72, 73 of inflation. And so the British government says, "Well, what are we going to do?" The British government say, "Well, look, we got all this goddamn tea. No one's buying it now because we got a recession going on in England. How about if you do this?" And what is this? One, loan the British East India Company some more money to bail them out, but secondarily say, "Look, you tell the British colonies over in North America that any tea they want, and by now they're as addicted to tea with sugar in it as anyone else is in the British Empire, that the only place you can buy tea is from British East India Company stores," which is a stunning reversal of what was going on in the colonies that stars, where entrepreneurs were saying, "I'm going to open a tea company. I'm going to open a tea store. I'm going to open a tea store." They're all put out of business. Yeah, especially the put out of business in Boston. And so, what do those merchants do? They do the Boston. They do they dress up as Indians and they throw the tea in they're merchants. Now, fair enough, what the British government has just done stinks. But on the other hand, it's not about freedom and democracy that the merchants are concerned about. It's about their profits. And then it exacerbates and exacerbates. And finally, you get this enormous long piece of property again called the Declaration of Independence. And Bob and I will have another debate over that. It's just a piece of garbage as far as I'm concerned, but whatever. It worked. It worked. So the Tea Act will start it off, and then it's one after another, and pretty soon we're independent. This is, as far as the story of the Silk Roads is concerned, Franco Pan has to make this point. It's a good point. It's a useful point. When does the trade, the Silk Road trade, finally collapse utterly and almost totally? It's not until 1857, because between 1850s, the 1650s and 1850s, the British East India Company and others are still paying bribes to these corrupt leaders. And that money does filter down at some level, not too much to the masses, but it does end up producing a subsidy of wealth to maintain palaces and buy horses and this and that in Samarkand and in Tehran and so forth and so forth. But after 1857, the British don't have to pay any bribes. Why don't they have to pay any bribes after 1857? What happens in 1857? There's this the Sepoy Revolt. What's the Sepoy Revolt? Who were the Sepoys? The Indians, and some were Muslim and some were Hindu, serving in the army of the British East India Company, and they revolt. There's 250,000 of them, and it was nip and tuck for a period of time. And the British will end up holding on, but not because the Sepoys are become loyal again. Although there is some clever back and forth where the British play the Muslims off of the Hindus and play divide and conquer a little bit, and that's but primarily it's because the British send in real troops from Britain and barely hang on, but they hang on. And now that they've hung on, the British government controls all of India. It's no longer the British East India Company with its bribes and the dark green. They're running India. It's the British Raj. And that will last exactly 100 years. And Queen Elizabeth becomes empress. She becomes an empress, and all this kind of nauseating stuff happens. And at that time, Russia The Russian Tsar was not only the Tsar, he was the emperor of an empire, emperor of the empire. And my God, we've got rivalry with Russia. Our queen's got to be an empress too. So, and at that stage, the opium is being promoted. The opium growing is being promoted like crazy. I mean, that's quite a graphic, and apparently it's an accurate graphic of stocking of rolling up balls of raw opium and opium leaves, and it's all headed mostly to China and some other places. It's just flat out. Well, we know it because it's being done to us by drug lords in Mexico and Europe and so forth. And so, and you've seen this diagram before, but 1850 is kind of an important moment. And what's going on in the 1850s? Well, in China, it's in between the two opium wars, and in India, the British government is going to take over now and run the show as they wish for 100 years. India will deindustrialize. China will itself deindustrialize, and that whole odd graphic that goes from wherever you want to start, but 1850 is not a bad place here. Will continue right up until about, when does it start to reverse? 1950, 1960, more or less. And I assume most of us in here can agree that trend is going to continue. That's the way it's going to be. That's the way it's going to be for some period of time. Maybe not. Maybe China will collapse, but hard to know. Russia's the question right now, it seems to me. Take this for what it's. I found this. I thought, I'll throw it up there anyway. I don't know that it's got much credibility. But you've got a Marxist economist, an Indian, who said, I've looked at the tax records, I've looked at the program records, and by my calculation, I think Britain came up with, $45 trillion worth of wealth during their time. Yeah, take it for what it's worth. Who knows? But these questions are being asked today, aren't they? Like blacks in America. What are we owed for having been slaves? We're owed something, surely, more than an apology, aren't we? Surely you have to admit, aren't you willing to, that some of the wealth in America was created was because we worked for nothing and had our families destroyed and this and that and so forth. And to some degree, it's still going on. Whatever the calculation is, it's something. And so you do it, but sooner or later, you're going to have to pay a price for that kind of exploitation. Road to crisis. India is the heart and soul of the British Empire. The heart and soul of the British Empire. They've got to maintain it if they're going to maintain the wealth that's pouring in, whether it's 45 trillion or 1 trillion or God knows what it is. It's worth something. What's the deal with, for example, British textiles? You don't make them anymore. You send the cotton to us. We will make the textiles and we'll ship them back to you, and you buy them. And salt and all the rest of it. So the great game. Some of you, I should have put this graphic first. If you've not read this, consider reading it. Some of you think you've read this book. It is riveting. It's so well written, and within 50 pages, you'll decide whether it's worth your time reading. But it is this rather famous book about the rivalry between Russia and India over Central Asia, which is going to be over the yellow part there. So there's the Russian Empire, there's the British India, there's the Qing or Manchu dynasty, there's the Persian Empire. It had been the Safavid dynasty. It's kind of corrupt for a while, but there's all that yellow stuff in the middle. Who's going to control it? And if it's the Russians, they're right on the door of the British India, and that could be the end of the British Empire. And if you read this stuff, you know how he unravels it. To me, it's a fascinating thesis. We can argue it in a minute here. But what's the thesis? There's various threats to the empire. Napoleon is the first one. He takes over Egypt in 1799. The British are going to defeat him there, and he's going to run back and become emperor or whatever. But he has the notion, it's an interesting notion, that he will continue on to India if he ever gets the chance. He doesn't get the chance, but he does come up with a plan to create, to curry favor with the rather corrupt Persian shahs at this time who were out of money because the trade is drying up, yada, yada, yada. And it's making some progress. So how does Britain react to Napoleon's attempts to create allies with Persia? Well, of course, they panic and they say we gotta outbid them. We'll send our guys to Iran as well with money, and we will behave in the most disgusting way. We'll bow when we need to bow. We hate it. These guys are disgusting, but we'll do it. And then in 1812 they switch. Why in 1812 do they say, oh, well, hell with Persia? Because in 1812, Napoleon, the real problem, is on his way to Russia. They say, you know, if Russia could defeat Napoleon, my God, that would save us a whole shitload of problems here. We're going to side with Russia, and so it's 1812. Let's see, we had the Star Spangled Banner 3 days ago. That's the War of 1812. We've got this Napoleon marching into Russia in 1812. In 1812, there's also another Russian war going on with Persia, which has been going on for some time. And the British were now siding with the Russians because they're going to help defeat Napoleon, play the central role in creating the treaty that will end that first Russian-Persian war, and they do it to the benefit of Russia. So So here's the red line shows the division between Russia and Persia before the war. All of this below the red is Persian territory. After that war, which is over in 1813, and a British brokered truce, everything below the black line will be Persian. And the Persians are going to lose even more as time goes on. In any case, the British are going back and forth who they're going to support, who they're going to side with, because it's convenient. Meanwhile, the Russians are, yeah, go ahead. Congratulations, by the way, congratulations. Which is right here. Well, it's even more interesting than that. It wasn't called Azerbaijan because these are Azoris. They're not. But many Persians don't consider them Persians. And so this whole part of Iran is Azoris who have been sort of a person, depending on what you read, a persecuted minority. But yeah, go ahead.
So the great spiritual leader, the great Ayatollah, was there.
Is Azeri? Yeah. Azeri. Not Persian, whatever the hell Persian means. Okay, so the British have now. That's a good. Now, the Russians, meanwhile, are feeling the ropes. After 1812, Alexander I is full of himself, and feeling that Russia's on the roll, and they seem to be. After all, they just helped defeat Napoleon, and they just gained territory in the Caucasus, and so and we're familiar. We're more than a little familiar with this. What's the reason for getting Fort Ross? There was no intention of going all the way down and challenging the Spanish or the British, who remember fur trade, and you need food up there in Alaska. Yeah, there's no. I mean, it's all fine and dandy to have fur traders up there, but they got to eat. So you need a colony down further south where you can provide food and fresh water. And so you got Fort Ross and the Russian River and blah blah blah.
At the risk of repeating myself, you had a Russian. They were starving up in Sitka, at their place in Sitka. And he came down to San Francisco, desperate to make a deal for grain. And he fell in love. Long story short, that the Russians turned into a very popular rock opera in 1970, and Americans had never heard of it. Now, if you want to look at the difference between Russians and Americans, they're passionate most.
Yeah, we just got beer and football. Yeah. The Caucasian Wars, the War of the Caucasus. This is Janet and I were all over this last year because we were in Georgia and Armenia, but it is quite dramatic. And it's Alexander the First again. He's still czar before he finally dies. So we're going to take the Caucasus. I mean, we're on a roll here. We've already got some territory for the Persians. The problem with that territory is it's full of crazy people. I mean, people that have lived in the mountains forever. They're like Bob's gun-toting relatives in Tennessee or Kentucky or wherever they are. And they're just nuts. And they're violent and this and that and so forth. And we're going to have to defeat them. And it's quite a tale. And if you ever pick up a history book or read some of the novels involving all this, it goes on for quite some time because these guys are tough fighters. And they're in their own territory and they're in the mountains and blah, 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 blah. But eventually the Russians will get it done. One of the key parts of getting it done is to finally build this Georgia military highway, which goes from southern Russia over the mountains to what's now Tbilisi. And that military highway not only allows the Russians to bring in more troops, but it divides the two factions to an east and west faction, both of them Muslim, that are become finally conquered and so forth. And there's some unbelievably interesting personalities that go along with this. Iman Shamil is one of these characters out of. He's not quite Genghis Khan, but he's a little bit like that. He loses, of course, but he fights on and on for some time. That's what we're talking about. The Caucasus is the area more or less in the red. So you're still in the plains of Russia here in Pyatigorsk, and then you go. I mean, it's this rough stuff. I'm talking about it with such detail because we've been there a couple times. In fact, we were there in 1977, and it's dramatic. Yeah, I mean, it's really quite something. You go over the Russian military highway, which is improved like crazy. Yeah, I don't know who that young lady is there with her, borrowing binoculars from the German tourists to look at some thing off in the distance that we knew nothing about. But last year when we went back, we actually knew something about it. I don't know where the gray hair comes from. I mean, and I think Frankopan makes a story about this. He tells with some detail. It was both the steppes themselves, romantic as they are, with horses and waving grain and wheat and all that. I mean, and all that romance of the steppes, but also the romance of the Caucasus as well. These interesting characters that lived there. Lots of books written about them. Every one of the great novelists of the time eventually wrote a book about that had to do with the Caucasus, and usually with dripping romance that was tended to favor the people of the Caucasus as good, honest Native Americans. Well, no, Native Caucasian. But the same stuff we get out of the Native American nobility and so forth. Some of which is true, but whatever.
Yeah. The Cossacks are Ukrainian.
The Cossacks are Ukrainian. Yeah, Cossacks are not. They did not live in the Caucasus, but they were on the base of the Caucasus.
And if you read the Ukrainian national anthem, there's a line there. Where we is free was the Cossacks. You know, because the Cossacks were like their minutes.
Right? If you read you want to where's it back here? I'm going in the wrong direction. Yeah, I want to go back. So you read, it's a short book. What Tolstoy is. I mean, he is so in love with the Cossacks romance. He's got this idiot Russian that falls in love with this gorgeous Cossack woman who leads him on and then just sort of dumps him.
But you know what else fell in love with Putin? He made them secure, gave them special security detail at the Sochi Olympics.
This is not over. this is story that this is stuff well known by anyone mildly educated in Russia. And then you get all the Romantic writers, led by this guy who was kind of the godfather of Borodin and Rimsky-Korsakov. And most of you have heard these things before. They're quite romantic about the steppes of Central Asia or Sherazad and the question that's being raised by the writers, by the musicians, by the intellectuals, both in Russia itself and in Europe, is, well, who are the Russians? Are they European? Are they Asian? Are they unique? And of course, the answers to those questions are impossible. They're whatever you want the answer to be. But when you're conquering that territory, the Russians have all this romance about it, like we have America the Beautiful and the waves of what the lines. It's the Purple Mountains Majesty, and on and on and on. So the Russians are on a roll, and it's possible that they will try and pick off India as well. How does Persia react to the Russian successes in the Caucasus? Well, they try a second attack, and they lose a second time, so they lose even more territory. And the British, of course, panic. The Russians are going to encourage the Tsar to attack Herat, which is sort of under the British. It's not really British territory yet. It's kind of undefined, but the British know that it's a good, safe, a good barrier for anyone trying to attack India. So they surely don't want Afghanistan into fall the Russian hands or everybody else's hands. And how you have the Russians encouraging the corrupt Shah to attack Herat. So the British counteract by saying, well, they attack an island down here and the Shah backs off because he didn't know what to do. But this great game is on big time. And then the Russians the British really screw up. I think most of you know the story. If not, it's stunning. The Russians say, we got to control Afghanistan. So we're going to put our guy on the throne there and throw out the guy that the Afghans themselves have sort of half chosen. But it doesn't take long, a few years, and hostility toward the British there grows. It's fed by the mosques, who are going to, rightly or wrongly, and most of it is incorrect, it's not honest, create rumors that the British troops are despoiling the Muslim women. There's probably a couple incidents where that's actually true. In any case, armed rebellion breaks out, and the British have to surrender. They say, okay, we've lost. We're willing to leave a retreat in the middle of winter when it's going to be snowing in the mountain passes is arranged. The Muslims, the Afghanis, are supposed to escort 16,000 British and their Indian servants back to India. They're all slaughtered. Every single one of them will die. Not all from gunshot wounds. Many will die from starvation or just freezing to death in the snow. But it's a dishonest. They're not going to be escorted to India. They're going to be killed along the way. One guy makes it. He's wounded. He's on a wounded pony. He gets back to a British fort in Jalalabad, which is now in Pakistan. He will survive. The pony will collapse. It's quite dramatic stuff. I assume if you're a British student, you know this hook, line, and sinker. Don't go to Afghanistan. They'll fail in other places. These two guys, Stoddard and Conley, are sent to Bukhara to try and arrange a treaty with the now very corrupt and poverty-stricken Khan, because it's 1857 by now, and the trade on the Silk Route is utterly dried up. Instead, they'll be arrested, they're thrown into a pit full of snakes, and they're probably brought out into that rather large square and beheaded. Maybe Janet and I will get to see that finally next year after 2 years of planning in Bukhara. The British will also try and recruit in the Khanate of Khiva. These are names that will mean absolutely nothing to you. They mean something to me because I've been reading about this stuff for 3 years. But these now very backward and very corrupt. They're falling apart like crazy. There's no Silk Road trade going through there anymore. and they've fought on really hard times. It's just cruel, the rule that these people have got. And part of their cruelty is they're going off to the steppes of Central Asia and rounding up Russian citizens and bringing them back as slaves. So this area is a mess, and the Indians have no success. The Russians don't have much success either for a while, and then will come the Crimean War. So interest in Central Asia for a little while is off the table because of the Crimean War, but it will return really rather quickly. What's the Crimean War theoretically all about? In theory, what starts it? It's crazy. And there's a debate between the Ottomans and the Russians over who will protect the Christians who want to go to Jerusalem and to the holy city of Jerusalem. The Ottomans say, well, it's our territory, and we will protect the Christians there. And the Russians say, yeah, but you don't let we Orthodox Christians go there. And so we get to, even though it's theoretically Jerusalem, your territory, you're such a backward empire now anyway, we get to control the Christians going, or protect the Christians going to Jerusalem. That's what the debate's all about. The British and the Russians say, this gives us a fantastic opportunity. We want to teach the British, we don't teach the Russians the last year. This is just great. Thank you for bringing up such a stupid idea. And the Russians catch wind of the British. The Russians are still looking for a warm war, right? The Turks have this territory. I chose this Russian. I consciously chose this Russian graphic because there's the city right there. Mariupol. And we're familiar with this territory rather desperately these days. Oh God! So there's history to all this. In any case, the Russians, the British, and the French will send in troops to teach the German and the Russians are less. The Russians invade first. The Russians are going to attack what we now call Romania and Bulgaria. The British counterattack. It's a nasty war. It's not pleasant. The Russians will lose because they're quite a backward country. And a peace will be created that will punish the Russians and so forth. Frankopan asked the question. So Marx is writing like crazy. He's writing a column every week for the New York Tribune now, and he writes like mad about how this supports everything he said in the Communist Manifesto. The Crimean War does. It proves, as I said, that it's just the interest of the British citizens aren't being served by this. It's all serving the interest of a few elite in the British Empire that are running the show. And in fact, the Caucasian War, the Crimean War ends the British government. There's so much suffering. Kids are died in Crimea for no reason whatsoever. The Charge of Life Brigade is not famous. Florence Nightingale, this is where she creates nursing. Things are pretty. There's a lot of most of the deaths are from dysentery, and the war. There's inflation back home because of the war. So some of what Marx said is sort of true. And how does Italy fit into this? I said I don't get this. Tell me about this, Mr. Frankopan. Well, the war. There is a peace treaty that's going to be held. Let's do Karl Marx first. He's writing from the New York Tribune. He wrote from the New York Tribune quite late. Engels wrote most of the articles because Marx's English was terrible, but whatever. But the treaty that's going to end the war is held in Paris, and there's Count Cavour. If you've never heard of him before, he is the prime minister of the Kingdom of Piedmont, Sardinia, which will eventually be the political unit, which is going to give create the momentum for for Italian unification. Well, Cavour comes onto the European scene, right? No one knows who he is, but after this peace treaty conference, they do know who he is. And they're sort of sympathetic to the idea of Italian unification. Whatever. The peace treaty, Russia is humiliated by this, and to the point that Alexander II says that we've learned our lesson. We are way too back. So from that moment on, there will be attempts to update the Russian army, and it makes progress. When World War I arrives, they've still not made enough progress, but they've made progress. Serfdom is wiped off the map. What year? Same year as the Emancipation Proclamation. 11 months before it. bloody, it's unbloody believable. Now, it, but at least serfdom is done away with. And European, Russian agriculture, which was already a money, they exported all, is going to now boom even more because the serfs now can work to some degree their own land, although there's issues about that. Industrialization gets going. Fair enough, when World War I rolls around, Russia has still not caught up, but they are catching up relatively fast. And so there's a fear in Europe of Russia. And above all, there's a fear by Britain. And now, having been insulted, the Russians say, well, one, we've got too many slaves, the Russian slaves, in these corrupt, stinking khanates. And two, we have got the motivation to take these territories. And rather quickly, the Russians will conquer first Turkmenistan, Turkestan, then what they call Bukhara, which is the green and yellow, then Khiva, which is another corrupt khanate. These were all divided up by these khans that are fighting each other. Then this blue area, then what is now mostly Turkmenistan, and finally the area which is mostly part of Kyrgyzstan and parts of Tajikistan. Thank you very, very much. In any case, the Russians are on a roll, and the British again are panicking because look how close they are to India. Now, there's no way the Russians are coming across here to India. That's the Hindu Kush Mountains. They're not going to come that way. But if they could come through Afghanistan, maybe they could come. This is long, and I wouldn't expect you to. I'm not going to read it. But this is Friedrich Engels writing in 1887. And once you write in 1887, there's no other war in Europe possible except the World War. And it's going to be a nasty war. 8 to 10 million people will probably kill each other. And the war is going to end in bankruptcy. States that existed are going to disappear. Kings will disappear, yada, yada, yada. How come Engels and these guys could see that was coming 30 years before it happened? And he's not alone in this, Mark. They all saw something like World War I was coming. I would argue because they saw what was going on, that imperialism was just flat out cruel, and the rivalry between these European countries was sooner or later going to come to blows, not in India, not in China, not in North America, but back home in Europe. And they were just flat out right. Now, whether you go along full bore with Frankopan's explanation for what really caused this is another issue. So, examples of the British fear of Russia being displayed by various issues. Russia says, come on, this peace treaty after the Crimean War stunk. How about us having access to the Black Sea? Most countries say we're willing to negotiate. Britain says no. The Queen Victoria now has to be made an empress because the Tsar of Russia is an emperor too. There's the growth of spies on both sides exacerbated. Britain will go back into Afghanistan twice more and again install guys. And this time it works, more or less. They have corrupt leaders there in Afghanistan. Is this too cold, by the way? Oh, and then there's the Trans-Siberian Railroad. This is not a map of the map. This is a map that the only one I could find that shows stuff accurately. But the Trans-Siberian Railroad, it's it's kind of long. It's Moscow to Vladivostok. How many days? You can still do it. I did it once. It's 8 days. So Moscow they start to build it. They've gotten to Irkutsk by 1898. That's almost to the Pacific already. To Vladivostok by 1904, but they have to go through Mongolia, which in theory is part of, well, not in theory, it was part of China at the time. But by 1914, just as the war is about to start, the Trans-Siberian Railroad has gotten all the way to the Pacific, all the way through Russian territory. This is proof that the Russians, while still perhaps somewhat backward in certain ways, are coming along rather fast and would be reason to be scared. The British react early on and occupy this island. It's just a tiny island off the southern coast of Korea, just to be there and intimidate the Russians when they eventually get to the Pacific Ocean. It turns out the British don't have to do a damn thing. The Japanese will do it for them. In 1905, the Japanese will attack a Russian port here in Korea, and the Russians and the Japanese win. And from that moment on, the Asians look around and say, "Whoa, whoa, maybe the Europeans aren't godlike. Maybe they can be beaten." That 1905 is a big moment. And furthermore, back in Russia, it creates the first revolution. It's a revolution that doesn't do a whole hell of a lot, but at least puts the Russians on notice. And then there's the Trans-Caspian Railroad, which starts from the Caspian Sea and is going to, in 1879, it has gotten to Samarkand by 1888, to Tashkent by 1899. And in 1889, they built a trunk road that goes right to the border with Afghanistan. It was in 30 miles of Herat. And Herat is an open door to India. Over the Hindu Kush, you're not going to do that. But Herat is an open door to India. And the British are scared to death. The Russians are on a roll. We're overextended. And then it gets even worse. The Persians, who are just taking money from whoever gives them the most, reject a renewal of British aid and say, we got a better deal from Russia. They're giving us more money. They're giving us better rates. The Trans-Caspian Railroad, that's in 1898. The Trans-Caspian Railroad has gotten to Tashkent by 1899. In 1900, it becomes known that the Russians are about to take a port down here in Persia, and the British are debating back home whether they should build a railroad from a place that they control, and it's now called Pakistan, but then it was part of India, all the way to the Gulf of Oman. They never do build it, but they're debating maybe we should do that, but we don't know if we have the money, blah, blah, blah. At the same time, the British are hunkered down in the Boer War. Some of you, this is in South Africa. Who are the Boers? These are the Dutch. The Dutch settlers. And the British have taken the Dutch colony from the Dutch under this whole Anglo-Dutch wars long before this happened. But the British, the Dutch settlers simply go inland, and they're left alone by the British, who basically just want a colony down here as a stopping point on the way to the Spice Islands. And so the Boers live here for about 60 years in relative peace, not peace with blacks, but peace with the British. And then what happens? Gold is discovered. And the British want part of that action. The British go to mine as well. The Dutch say, you can come here, but you can't vote. There's a war fought, and it's a nasty war. The British have overwhelming power, but the Boers, it's their territory. They fight courageously. It's ugly. There's some pretty nasty stuff that goes on. The British are ordered to destroy farms, slaughter livestock, and then they round up civilians, mostly women and children, and put in concentration camps. 26,000 died. 20,000 blacks in these concentration camps. Concentration camps had already started. This is not the first time in Europe. The Spanish had created concentration camps in Cuba, and the Cubans fought for independence, and many died there as well. But it's quite ugly, and so the British are stuck there, and then they're stuck in China because there's the Boxer Rebellion, which is not just anti-British, it's anti-every European because the Europeans have divided up China. But it's nasty. There's a question of whether all the British and Germans and Russians and everyone that are hanged in Beijing are going to be slaughtered or not. And there's a real chance that they might. It's eventually put down. the Manchu government itself is backing the Boxers. And so the British are really under the gun. And as Frankopan says, in 1901, there's this doom-laden report that comes to the cabinet saying, once this Trans-Caspian Railroad is finished, the Russians are going to be able to deliver 200,000 troops in this area and 100,000 right up to the borders of Afghanistan. And by that time, the Russian population has grown to 136 million. It's not that now. The British UK population is, maybe a third of that. The English population less than that. It is pretty clear to the British that they probably they may not be able to defend India against the Russians if they keep coming. And here you can take a deep breath and say, I don't necessarily buy this. He's made, to my mind, a pretty good argument. What's the solution to their problem with Russia, according to Frank? Give them a free hand in Europe. Let them do what they want. In other words, our overseas empire is more important to us than any problems we would have in Europe. And by the way, we're an island nation anyway. So if there's a war, we probably won't have to be involved in it too much. We gotta make friends with Russia. We cannot afford to lose India. That's the end of our empire. And you've got all these quotes. He's the foreign secretary. We're not going to obstruct Russian foreign policy in Europe. Let them have what they want. And so according to Frankopan, this becomes the British strategy. Let's do what we can to create an alliance with Russia, and we'll promote it the best we can. They are already, before 1905, have made a deal with the French. They're frightened. This is, if I don't know, this would be like us making a deal with God knows who, Putin, China. How long have the British and the French been enemies in European history? Up to 1904, a long time. And then 1904 said, let's be friends. We've got mutual problems other places. And so what's the core of the friendship? Let's negotiate over where we've had debates. Britain, you've got Egypt. France, you've got Morocco. This was interesting to us, although Spain gets a little bit of it. We will negotiate in West Africa. France gets some stuff in West Africa. We'll sort out Nigeria. The French are going to renounce their claim of fisheries in Newfoundland. We will negotiate over what we call Thailand. The French are calling it Indochina. Basically, we British are going to allow you to have that as a sphere of influence. We got Burma though, right? This is all sort of worked out, and the hands are. There's not a lot of trust here, but they're trying to make it work. And only 3 years later, the English reached out to the Russians and say, let's be buddies. And the rivalry over Central Asia is over. Both are say this is useful for us because the Germans are threatening. They end their complaints over Persia, blah, 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 blah. The Russians agree to stay out of Afghanistan, yada, yada, yada. So the English have become buddies with the French. The English have become buddies with the Russians. And it's just obvious what's going to now happen. You're going to have a triple entente. The three countries that are going to be allies in World War I have pulled it together. And this forces then Germany to reach out to find allies. And according to Frankopan, the British are willing to pay this price. The price is going to be, we're going to have hostility with Germans. The Germans know exactly what's going on. And we're going to have trouble with the Germans. But we're willing to pay that price because it's more important that we hold on to India and other things. This is if you've never heard this before, and I hadn't, this causes one to rethink things and say, yeah, this has got to be taken into consideration. I mean, this is not, he's built up a pretty strong case here, even if it's, you'll only go halfway or a third of the way or so forth. And he will then go further and say, and the suspicions continue right up to World War I. Britain is scared to death that Russia is not trustworthy, and they're going to pull out of the deal. And so they keep allowing Russia to get away with stuff that maybe they shouldn't have gotten away with. The Germans now are completely understanding what the hell's going on, and they have to plan for a two-front war. And once you have planned for a two-front war, it's interesting how your plans might get put into action under certain circumstances. Meanwhile, Russia is afraid of Germany. Of course, they're afraid of Germany. Germany's relatively strong. They've got a plan of their own. If they're attacked, they will fall back behind this red line that I've drawn, and then counterattack, just as they did with Napoleon. And that was 100 years ago, and maybe it won't work anymore. And the pink line here doesn't much matter. And the Ottoman Empire is stuck. We've always had trouble with Russia. We're going to have to find allies with somebody. They're sort of stuck with allying with Germany, and Germany may be a pretty good bet anyway, because Germany's looking fairly strong in any case. Still, Frankopan says in May and even June, if you'd have been in Britain, you wouldn't have felt any great panic over an oncoming war with Russia. And he cites in particular a celebration of German culture that's going to take place in Oxford. Kaiser Wilhelm's picture, this is it, is hanging up in one of the Oxford sites as late as June 1914. Various British German scholars come. They're being given honorary degrees. If that is part of the proof, it seems to be fairly legitimate. And then on June 28th, the Archduke Ferdinand, who's going to become the king as soon as the old guy dies, and he's going to die soon, is assassinated in Sarajevo, which is Serbia, and Serbia wants to be independent. It doesn't want to be part of the Austrian-Hungarian Empire. And from that moment on, it all goes to hell. That's June 28th. Just as Frankopan says, as soon as the assassination happens, the fear of Russia, in his opinion, goes crazy. What's Germany's fear? That Russia, if there's going to be a war, let's have it as soon as possible, because Russia is coming on. They may not be ready yet, but they're going to be ready before long to be the decisive military power in Europe. So if there's going to be a war, let's have it now. France is saying, we're not ready for war. And if Russia is going to go to war, we have no choice but to back them. We can't afford to lose Russia as an ally. Furthermore, it's not mentioned by Frankopan, but the entrepreneurs, the banks of France have gotten enormous loans. They've given enormous loans to France, to Russia. I mean, they're up to their eyeballs in wanting to get those loans back. They've got to stick with Russia if they're never going to get their money back. If Russia's defeated, they'll never get their money back. And Britain, what's Britain's fear? It's always the fear. Russia will switch sides, but Russia's not a trustworthy ally. That Russia is in for its own interest, and they could easily make a deal with Germany tomorrow. What's the proof of that fear? 1939, the Stalin-Hitler pact, the Stalin-Hitler non-aggression pact. It's a legitimate fear, and so they say, we got to stick with it. If Russia's going to move, we got to stick by them. They're kind of calling their shots here, and so I mean, this is a laundry list. Oh boy, just happened. What happened? What happened? Yeah, are we done? Yeah, I know. Me. This is. I don't want to reboot there. I want to reboot here. The assassination happens on June 28th. On July 2nd, the Austrian ambassador in Berlin writes to his king that German army wants Austria to attack Serbia. Well, why is Austria going to attack Serbia? It's a Serbian that has just assassinated their archduke. And the Germans say, go ahead and attack. And on the next day, he reports back and says they'd like it. If there's going to be a war, the Germans would like it to come now. This is famously called the German blood chain. Austrians, go do what you want, and we will back. There's a million. This is frantic back and forth. The British are scared to death of them. The French are too. There's negotiations left and right, but you get as far as July 23rd. And the French and Russians have agreed that they're together. They're not going to back off on each other. If Serbia is attacked, they have firmed this up, that Russians and French are going to stay as allies. On the same day, Austria says to Serbia, either you take it all back, you meet these 10 demands, or we're going to invade. 2 days later, Serbia accepts almost all the demands, but will not accept that there's going to be some investigation and trial of Serbians linked to the assassination. And 3 days later, Austria invades. And 2 days later, Russia counterattacks. Why is Russia going to counterattack? They say, well, here, I'll tell you why. The Russians wrongly, they've got it wrong, they're full of themselves, have said, we've been pushed around, we've all these crises, Germany's full of itself, we've lost on some of these debates before, we've backed down too often, and we're pretty sure we're ready to go. And once Russia sends its troops forward, the Germans call and say, we don't want to fight. Bring him back. And the Russians say, sorry, we don't have the telegraph office down there. Sorry, the war is on. And so they just stumble into it. And of course, and as soon as the war starts, then the propaganda crap starts. It starts in the United States like crazy, real soon. Germany's to blame. And that's what we're taught. We were all taught that. It was Germany's fault, Germany's aggression, Germany's arms race in Britain, and Germany surely was behaving poorly. There's no question about it. But it's probably more complicated. Frankenstein has made his own case. There was fear of Russia, which is the bigger deal. Germany's fearful too. This is a famous cartoon. What's the famous cartoon? Turner's saying it. Who's to blame? Everybody. How can everybody be to blame? Because you're all doing imperialism. Every single one of you is doing imperialism. And you created this arms race and this scramble for colonies, and most of the colonies are gone. And what do you think? The war is going to come home. Of course it does, just as Engels had thought. So the propaganda starts. And we were taught, I was taught, we were all taught Germany's fault. The Allies won. They did. Thank you, Woodrow Wilson, for coming in and saving. Frankenstein says, yeah, be a little bit careful. One, be aware of these massive peace movements. There was a huge peace movement in the United States right up to the start of the war. And even during the war, we should not be doing this. And one can easily argue, I think, or I don't know, easily argue, but strongly argue, they were right. We had there's no reason for us to get in the damn war. The argument goes that we had ship sank. We knew that ship contained weapons. The Russians, our government knew they contained weapons. The Lufthansa. Yeah. It was the argument, but Russia's the problem. I think there's some quotes back there. We cannot afford to let Russia down. In the long run, Russia's the problem. And furthermore, a two-front war, Germany can't win a two-front. Germany came within what a spade, a simple garden spade of winning that war. What? The first battle was with Russia. The Russians attacked from the east. They were wrong. It was the Battle of Tannenberg, and the Germans won east, and the Russians were on defensive. Now the Russians fought on and lost more soldiers, more people than anybody else in the war by far. And they fought on, until finally, until Lenin took over. So the very first battle was but that was over in 3 days. And then it was the Blitz, what we call the Blitzkrieg then, but it was the March. And the sleeping. First, we knock out of France, which will be easy. We did it in 1870. It'll be easy again. And then the real battle comes, Russia. It's the same. Hitler had the same attitude. And what they were within 20 miles of Paris. And what saved the French? A simple garden spade. What did they do? They dug trenches. Oh, we're going to be killed. Oh, hell. Dig trenches. And it worked. It was unexpected. And it stopped the German advance. Because there was no tanks yet. There was no, there was airplanes had been invented, but they were, if you were going to drop a bomb, you were sort of throwing it out the cockpit. So there was no real way to bridge the gap. And the French had machine guns. And so if you could dig trenches and you could hide behind in that trench and hit machine guns, you created no man's lands real quick. And of course, as we all know, that went on for finally the French and the French soldiers in 1960 said, we're done. We are not going into no man's land. We're on strike. And we're not fighting anymore. We're just waiting for the Americans. And we think Woodrow Wilson will bring the Americans in. That's a question. I don't know the answer to that question. I don't know the answer to that question. And they had to deal with Belgium. Yeah. Yeah. Correct. The expectation had been that they would come the same direction they came in 1870, and instead they marched to the flat. Yeah, I think. And there's in this cartoon, there's Bill. So the cartoonist has confirmed your point to say, Belgium is going to blame Germany, and so all that. We could get stuck here for 8 days on arguing about all this stuff, and I want to move forward, but let's continue a little bit. Go ahead.
Well, with Belgium, Britain had sort of midwife
the creation of Belgium.
And there was the royal family were closely linked to
Oh, it's true, but so were the Russians and the Germans, but whatever. Yeah. Exactly. So those links. I mean, it's just unbelievable that happened. You look back and you say, if when you teach this sort of incorrectly, you say, well, it happened, and the right side won, and all that kind of stuff. People say it should have never happened. This was an asinine piece of nonsense. Oh yeah, I don't how. I'm sorry. I'm trying to get up to the next. No, I've really gone crazy. What's going on here?
August 3rd. That's our next.
No, but that's yeah. I'm going. Oh, because I'm going backwards. I'm going back. No wonder. What an ass. Yeah. You should see me trying to change a diaper. It's really and I'm talking about my own, not the never mind. Why are you laughing so loudly? Okay, so this war. What else is cited by? He says there's this enormous body of anti-war poetry that the British are writing through the whole thing. People there's 300,000 court martials of people that didn't want to fight, and then it's not. I remember reading this and confirmed it by the research shows pretty clearly that less than a fifth of the soldiers that fought fired a weapon. They didn't want to kill somebody, and of those that did, most aimed to miss. So it was an absurd. The French refused to go into battle, and then Woodrow Wilson gets involved, and so the right side won, and then so the point is made. In what way were the so-called winners not winners at all? Well, Britain was in enormous debt and stayed in debt right through World. They, they had they'd had this empire, and now and to whom were Britain in debt to us, and because and France which was not very well industrialized anyway, had enormous between the wars. Internal politics were uglier than they were as ugly as ours are now, to the point that fascists came close to winning once Hitler had taken over. He makes the point yet again. Maybe it drives you crazy, but I like it. This redistribution of wealth was similar to the redistribution of wealth between the Americas and after Columbus. Europe is going to be broke. The United States is going to get rich. The United States has got even more ISIS to defend us. Yada yada yada. So this is not. I mean, this is 9 kings of Europe. This was to celebrate the death of some king, somebody in Britain. These 9 guys. What? It's a long time for this to be over, and it was now all this kingship stuff. We were going to have whatever we have, and then he gets on with which is going to be the rest of the story all the way to the end of the book. Oil, the Anglo-Persian Oil Company. If you didn't read any of these other chapters, read this. It's short and it's good. Anglo-Persian Oil Company, founded in 1909, renamed the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company because the Shah wants it renamed the National Iranian Oil Company. When in 1951, the Iranians say it's ours, we're nationalizing it, it's not yours anymore. But in 1953, the British and the Americans organized an overthrow of Mohammad Mossadegh, the prime minister, and install the guy that's going to be overthrown by Ayatollah Khomeini, and that just brings us up to date. So oil, this guy, if you didn't read it, read it. I mean, he gets lucky. His father has had to move to Australia because he's lost money. He's gone bankrupt back home in England. His son gets involved with an investing scheme for gold in Queensland, and it comes through. And he's incredibly wealthy. He moves to England. He marries his second wife. His first wife has died. He becomes fat. He throws lavish parties. He's living a good life. And then the Iranian deal makers are looking for someone else because they don't have the money. They're broke to invest in oil. Everyone knows there's oil somewhere in Iran, in Persia. And oil is becoming an issue now as far as hydrocarbons go. It happened relatively quickly, but oil has got some advantages over coal, some real serious advantages. And the first investor will in giving money to explore for oil will bail out. This Darcy will sign in. Look at the deal he gets. Look at the deal he gets. He's going to get 60 years control of all the oil, all the natural gas, all the asphalt, all this whatever the hell a rocks is. The Shah is going to get 20,000 pounds right that day, another 20,000 when the company's formed, and 16% annually. And that deal holds right up until 1979, when the Shah is overthrown. The British government, of course, is going to be heavily involved in getting this deal to happen. They're making a deal. In May 14th, Darcy is asked, he said, I've wasted enough money. I'm done. We're pulling out. 14 days later, they hit the mother lode in that red dot in the Persian Gulf. And the Anglo-Persian stock is offered. You've got to build infrastructure in 1909. Enormous amounts of money is raised. The first pipeline is built to this island, the Cargo Island in the Persian Gulf, to ship the oil back to Britain. Of course, Iran, the anger in Persia will percolate and percolate and percolate and percolate. In 51, the Iranians nationalized it. The CIA and the British Foreign Office is able to overthrow that. Just a year later, Guatemala, yada, yada, And yet another statement about Columbus. He said, this is yet another example of somebody else's wealth going back to Europe, this case. And so that's, in the meantime, oil is critical to maintaining Western dominance of the globe for a little while longer. Oil is critical to Germany and Japan being defeated. Germany can't get the oil. Japan doesn't get the oil. That probably has maybe more to do with anything else of us winning to the right side. You're gonna get more corruption, and you're also gonna get this, the start of the burning of massive amounts for cars, that and so forth. What advantage does oil have in ships, whether they're oil ships? The advantage is the mechanism is much more powerful. You got much more powerful engines, and you can stay at sea much longer because you can resupply oil much easier than having to come to port to stash another huge pile of coal to bring your coal stuff. It's got enormous, and the British know this, and they're building oil ships, oil engine ships in 1904, and they know they've got to have oil. If they have oil and Germany doesn't, or other people don't, they're going to be in charge. The Anglo-Persian oil company is in trouble. It's going to go bankrupt in 1912. This guy is sitting with Winston Churchill, who's prime minister at the time. Jackie Fisher says, we can't let them go on. We got to buy the stock in this company and keep it afloat. We need to have the oil. And in 1914, 11 days before the assassination of the Archduke, the British company buys 51% of what's eventually going to become British oil. And I'm going to never mind that. World War I, as soon as World War I starts, immediately, within the first couple of months, the British take the island to which the oil pipeline is running, and they also take Boston, which we know from the Iraq-Iran war and our own war there, Boston, because that's also got oil. And in World War I, the British go scrounging for allies to protect their oil, whether they're corrupt or not. This guy is in theory in charge. He got the right to protect Mecca. His family, the Hashemites, will lose to the Saudis in controlling Arabia. His third son is the most interesting of them, the three. This is Alec Guinness in the Lawrence of Arabia. This is Faisal, and Faisal, and Lawrence of Arabia says, I can work with Faisal. This is shameless self-promotion, but this is where many of the scenes in Lawrence of Arabia were filmed, and we were just there. This great. You're looking for allies in the Arab world. You're promising the Arabs stuff that you don't know if you can deliver or not. First, you got to win the war, but you're promising stuff, and you're also promising the Russians some pretty cool stuff too. Why? Like, for example, what? We'll give you Constantinople. Why in the world would the British promise the Russians that in 1915? Because they're still fearful of what they've always feared, that the Russians will switch. The Russians will switch sides and become allies of the Germans. And they say, we got to give them something, And then this crazy thing happens. What was the invasion of Turkey, the Ottomans, was supposed to be way down in the southwest, which is right where Turkey and Syria come together. But instead, the British say, we got to prove to the Russians that we're really serious about Constantinople. So let's invade here instead. And where's here? Gallipoli. And of course, the tragedy of that.
They tried to force the Dardanelles, and they tried to just sail right up to
Good luck.
Istanbul, and they hit all the
They hit on the mines.
This
This is when Kemal Ataturk makes his career. He's the one that leads the Ottoman resistance that wins the Battle of Gallipoli. If you've never seen that movie, Gallipoli, it's really quite a good movie. It's disturbing as hell, even though it's got that crazy guy. What's Mel Gibson? He's good. He plays. Yeah, he's brave. Yeah, okay, never mind. And then Franklin keeps twisting the dagger. Keeps twisting the dagger. Okay, the war is nowhere near over. The Americans are not in the war. The Germans are not dead yet. The Russians are not doing very well, but already the Allies are dividing up the territory that they hope to win because it's got oil in it. And so this is famous. This is a famous scene in Lawrence, Arabia. It is kept secret, but it's not secret to everybody. The British Sykes and the Frenchmen have already come up with this deal of what happens to the oil territory after the war. That never comes to. Neither does this. This is the treaty that eventually mentioned. This never happens. This is what was supposed to happen after World War I. That this was going to be the Ottoman Empire, right here. That was all it's going to be. And this was going to be French territory and British territory. There was going to be Armenia, and this was going to be kind of Kurdish territory. And the Greeks would get this, and the Italians would get this. And this would be controlled by the British. Why does that not happen? Because the Turks started World War I all over again. They said, "Oh, really? Well, we're ready to fight," and they do fight, and negotiations come, and that, after 3 years of fighting, becomes the arrangement, and that looks pretty familiar. It looks real familiar because that's what happens, and of course, whatever. And Alec Guinness goes with Lawrence. Alec Guinness goes with Peter O'Toole to Versailles, and they get told to go to hell. But still, the British say, "Well, we'll give you something. We'll give you Iraq." What the hell is Iraq? We've never heard of Iraq. Well, it's this crazy country we put together. It's got some Sunnis and some Shiites, and it probably won't work, but it's got oil in it. So that's all that matters to us. Yeah, and you're a king until you die. And then there's the Red Line Agreement. This is at the very end of the chapter, and he doesn't tell you the details, which really is irritating. What's the Red Line Agreement? It's arranged by this deal maker, Mr. 5%. He gets together with the interested parties that have got oil well drilling going on and says, "How about now that there's an arrangement with Turkey, and Turkey is now a republic and all that kind of stuff, how about we make this deal with you oil drilling people about who controls the oil in all the old Ottoman territory here? You, the British, will get part of it. And the Dutch, because you got oil, will get another part, an equal part. The French will get an equal part. The Americans will get an equal part, and I'll get 5%. So what's that equal part that they all get in 1928? 23.75%. The British, the Dutch, the French, the Americans. Why wouldn't these be pissed? And so this, if for the rest of the book, you're going to hear about the oil and oil and oil. Why in October 1917 are the British thrilled that there's going to be a Russian Revolution and a civil war to follow? I think, God, that's the end of Russia. I mean, in 1917, this was all that the Bolsheviks controlled. All the rest of this colored territory is controlled by foreign powers, including the Ukraine, is going to try and defeat the Bolsheviks. Brought Japanese out here. We send troops in. There's this weird. The Georgians declare independence. Down here in Central Asia, the Uzbekis declare independence, and the assumption is there's no way in hell the Bolsheviks can win that civil war. But of course they do. And so why a few years later, were the British more than half the Soviet Union existed? I think it's obvious, no? It's not clear that Germany wouldn't have won without the Soviet Union existing. Japan's another story altogether, but the Soviet Union held them off long enough, the U.S. to get in the war, and sort of save the day. And I mean, Putin's an ass. He's a jerk. He's a son of a bitch. Still, there's more to the story than simply that plucky Ukrainians deserve to have a free country and all that kind of stuff. I mean, they do. Just like the Russian citizens, the decent Russian citizens deserve to have a free and fair country as well. But apparently, that's not on for a while. So
what happened to the Armenian
uh,
genocide?
in his story,
Turkey was
in his
fighting
story,
back at the Second World War I.
Adam, they'll argue with some truth that there had been the Armenians that started. That they had attacked the Turks first, but it's you say okay, but why did that require genocide? That's to be resolved. Although, who saves Georgia right now? Who defends Armenia right now? Who's the key to Armenia staying in the country? Russia. The bond between Russia and Armenia is the Russians got 10,000 troops there. They got we saw them. We saw the troops moving back. Our Russian guide, our Armenian guide, who doesn't like the Russians whatsoever, says, I don't like them, but we need them here. In fact, if we didn't have them, we may have gone down the tubes completely in our war versus Azerbaijan. The Russians saved us against Azerbaijan. Now, one country to the north, Georgia's having trouble sleeping these days, thinking, oh, God, are we next? Because the Russians have a real romantic liking for Tbilisi, and we've already made ourselves asses.
So, the genocide, at the beginning of the war, were Armenians sympathetic to the help Christian Russians?
Yeah.
And
now,
are the Russians protective of the help Christian Armenians, even though they're politically closer to the
it's got nothing to do with Christianity. It might Putin's mind, but it's got to do with having they've got their tendrils all over the place. Armenia is poorer now than it was under the Soviet Union. Any Armenian will tell you that. They're not in good shape. And you say the same for Uzbekistan, for Kyrgyzstan, for Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan. Kazakhstan's okay because they got oil. Turkmenistan is okay because they got oil. Azerbaijan is fine. They got the same Baku oil they always have. But we'll find out if we get to go next summer, if we hear that. But we say, now most of that generation has died off. But I read 2 or 3 fantastic, in my opinion, well-written guidebooks about Central Asia that were written only a decade after the fall of the Soviet Union. And it was Russian, Uzbeki, the older generation now said we were so much better. We weren't free, but we had an economy. We were connected to we were plugged in. The central planning may be shitty as far as efficiency of moving things around, but the central planning gave us a role in the Soviet Union where we had products to sell. We had a guaranteed market. We had better education. We had ballet. Russia civilized. When Russia invaded in the 1860s and the 1870s, these were some of the most backward, barbaric places on the face of the earth. And Russia, while to the point of view of Germans and British and French may have been backward, as to the point of view of Central Asians, they were advanced civilization that brought education and respect for women and blah, 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 blah. So it's more complicated than we get. And give him credit for saying, let's rethink this just a little bit. And you could, yeah. And give you guys credit too for reading. Is it 10 o'clock? Is it? Yeah, yeah, it's good. That's good. Oh, wait till the next time we'll have Tajiki mess. Yeah, what's this?
History of BP.
Oh, hey, did you read this?
Only parts. So
Yeah, it's probably.
take your time. You can have it as long
Thank
as
you.
want.